Again, hello everybody. On behalf of Equal Justice Society, California ChangeLawyers, and Public Rights Project, welcome to today's webinar, Change from the Chambers, Courts, Law Clerks, and the Pursuit of Equal Justice. My name is Christina Alvarez, and I'm the Judge Constance Baker Motley Civil Rights Fellow with Equal Justice Society, and I will be moderating our call today. A few housekeeping notes before we get started, and as folks keep trickling in. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you after the call. The webinar is scheduled until 1:15 p.m. We will hear from our panelists from the first hour, and in the final 15 minutes will be dedicated to answering your questions. Feel free to send in your questions at any time today by typing your question into the Q&A box that is at the bottom of the screen. Be on the lookout in the chat box, separate from the Q&A, for some resources that we might be sharing during our discussion. Please also feel free to use the chat to share any relevant experiences you may have as we move through the webinar. We have a brilliant panel of experts today who will be discussing with us what it means to clerk for a judge as a person of color. In our current court system, there remains a concerning lack of diversity for clerkship positions at all levels. According to a 2017 survey by the National Association for Law Placement, at both the federal and state levels, only 1 in 5 law clerks were people of color. African American men and Hispanic men in particular remain the most underrepresented groups relative to their share among law school graduates. So given this moment in our nation's history, as we continue the fight for justice for George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, and countless other victims of racial injustices around the nation, we hope to inspire the next generation of lawyers to see that law clerks in fact play a unique role in the legal system that allows them to push us towards a more just society. Our goal today is to provide you, law students and recent graduates of color, many of whom are first-generation law students and lawyers, with the information you need about the process of obtaining a judicial clerkship. We hope that you learn from our panelists not only what to expect from a clerkship, but exactly how having more law clerks of color fits into a broader goal of promoting racial justice and making our court system more equitable for people of color. With that said, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists before we get into our first question. The Honorable Edward Chen is a United States District Court Judge for the Northern District of California. He was nominated by President Obama in 2009 and confirmed in 2011. He is a graduate of UC Berkeley School of Law, and following his graduation, Judge Chen clerked for U.S. District Judge Charles B. Renfro and U.S. Court of Appeals Chief Judge James R. Browning of the Ninth Circuit. Our next panelist is Feiruz Abdullah, the Director of Employer Relations at UC Hastings in San Francisco. Feiruz is a graduate of the University of San Francisco School of Law. In her current role, she has designed programs and trainings for students focused on public service and social justice careers, including judicial clerkships, solo practice, postgraduate fellowships, and career transitions. Next, we have Cara Sandberg, who is a chambers attorney for Justice Mariano Florentino Cuellar of the California Supreme Court. Cara is a Berkeley Law graduate and has clerked for 2 judges, Judge O. Ruggieri Thompson of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit and Judge Susan Y. Ailston on the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California. Finally, we have Stephen Wilson joining us, who is a trial and appellate litigator in Boyce Schiller Flexner's San Francisco office. Stephen also graduated from Berkeley Law, and prior to joining Boyce Schiller, he clerked for Judge Deborah L. Cook of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Welcome to all of our panelists. And with that, let's dive into our first question, which is directed at everyone. First, what is a law clerkship, and how can a law clerk best use their position to combat systemic inequality?
I can tackle the first part of that question. So a judicial clerkship is a full-time paid postgraduate position working directly for a judge in state or federal court. Clerkships usually last 1 or 2 years, but some judges do employ 1 or 2 experienced clerks who work for them longer term. As a judicial clerk, your job responsibilities include drafting orders and opinions, and then working with the judge in a close and very careful editing process to finalize those orders and opinions. Often that process will include a great deal of back and forth of exchanging drafts with your judge, taking red lines, and then implementing their edits. You'll also write memos and engage in discussion with the judge about any cases that are scheduled for hearing, and that's to help prepare them for oral argument or any pending hearings. You also are often asked to offer advice to the judge about issues that they should consider and how they might consider ruling. Many chambers also take on law student externs, and so law clerks also have an opportunity to help develop law student externs in their own learning, providing them feedback, providing them mentoring, which is a particularly exciting opportunity for young lawyers. And most importantly, it's an opportunity to work in a very fast-paced and intellectually challenging environment. So a judicial externship is clerkship is an invaluable experience that provides you with an opportunity to see all of the behind-the-scenes workings of a court. It can give you insight into the decision-making process of judicial officers and judicial bodies. It can help focus and improve your legal writing and research skills. It offers you an opportunity to make incredible connections with other brilliant clerks who are working in your courthouse, and it can foster a lifelong mentorship relationship with your judge. So as far as where clerkships take place, they can occur in state court, like where I currently serve at the California Supreme Court, federal district court, which is a trial court, federal appellate court, which are the 11 federal circuit courts, and then also specialized courts and tribunals like immigration court, court of federal claims, U.S. tax court, and administrative agencies. Many state courts also have some specialized courts, and so that's an area that you should consider looking into as well. Clerkships are a great way to observe various styles of lawyering. You carefully review briefs and attend oral argument, which gives you an excellent chance to see practitioners in your jurisdiction. It can also help you determine the particular area of practice you might be most interested in. You'll see a wide variety of legal issues in any clerkship, which can be an excellent learning opportunity for a recent graduate or a young attorney.
Thank you, Cara. Anybody else? Oh, Judge Chen, I think you're on mute.
All right, sorry about that. Cara's given you an extremely comprehensive and I think thoroughly accurate review of what a clerkship is, what clerks do, what the opportunities are. But I want to say something about how important they are from the judge's perspective. I work on a very busy court. It's a district court of the Northern District of California, trial court level. On average, we may have at any one time 300 to 400 cases. Actually, when I started, I had about 500 civil cases on my docket, plus another 50, 60, 70, 80 criminal cases. And those cases generate a lot of work. Any given week on our law and motion calendar, I have a weekly civil law and motion calendar. We may have anywhere from 3 to 10 cases where there are motions, motions to dismiss, motions for summary judgment, preliminary injunction, class certification. And I think it's no secret that judges without clerks could not do a job the kind of job that we are confronted with every day. And that's true at every court level. So the law clerks play an indispensable role. And maybe we'll get into this later about what role clerks, the theme of this topic webinar today about, what can clerks do to ensure equal justice. But clerks have an enormous amount of influence, just in terms of researching the law, researching the case, giving the judge advice. The judge can't read every single case, can't read every single affidavit. So we have to depend to a certain extent on the law clerks to help us frame the issues, help us give us the basic legal principles. And often you will see there's a lot of back and forth, because a lot of times I'll ask my clerk, that didn't sound right. What about such and such a case? Or I remember having a case that went this way. Can you look that up? And we'll get into a dynamic. But just in terms of finding the law, researching the law, and helping the judge is indispensable to the process. I will also say that clerks can also play a role as kind of a consciousness and a connection to other circles, other generations that the judge might not have. And sometimes there are just reactions, visceral reactions. It might be to a witness testifying and having a different break, or it might be discussing what kind of sentence a defendant should receive. And that's where clerks, especially diverse clerks from a wide variety of backgrounds, can bring some life experiences, even though they may not be as many life experiences as a judge, but they can bring something to the table to help educate the judge on more than just what's in the books, but also sort of what the real world is like. And there clearly are generation gaps. If you look at most federal judges, they're 50s, 60s, and some in the 70s, even older. We're from a different generation, and I find myself really enriched a lot by talking to people who are another generation behind and learning, whether it's about, trends, culture, technology, all sorts of things. So clerks play an indispensable role, both, I think, on a personal level as well as on a kind of a scholarly level as well.
I'll add on to Judge Chen's last point there, which is that a big part of the clerkship experience is the personal relationship you build with your judge and the other clerks in your chambers. Often that's a group of 5 or so people. And so when we talk about or think to the numbers that Christina laid out about diversity among federal clerks, in my experience, and I think for a lot of other former clerks who are people of color, it means you're the only person of color in your chambers, for example. And so my advice actually, or I guess to me, one of the biggest things you can do in terms of advocating or pushing for systemic equity is to get personal with your judge. And that means, so I clerked on a federal court where there was a practice of going out to dinner with the other judges on the panel and their clerks. And so again, in those scenarios, I'm often the only Black clerk or the only LGBT clerk there. And I see that as an opportunity to sort of speak to those experiences. You hear Judge Chen talk about that there are various elements of your life experience that will bear out in the course of your clerkship. And I think that is sort of getting personal and really leaning into those opportunities to have dinner and talk about your family and what you and your partner did this past weekend, or what you and your family do over holidays, and how that is either in common or something that makes you different, is a critical part of being a clerk and really offering your judge the kind of counsel that they're really asking for, which is to point out the things that they may not see on the first pass, but do matter in that case.
Two examples came to mind, Christina, that I just wanted to relay. Example of the influence clerks can have. One, I clerked for a circuit judge, and I worked on a case in which memos were circulated. It was a civil rights case, had to do with timeliness of a wrongful prosecution case brought against some police officers who gave false testimony. And the memo came out concluding that the statute of limitations had run, case should be dismissed. Something didn't seem right to me, so I researched some more. I came up with a different angle, a different mode of analysis to find a way to save the cause of action. And I was really pleased that the panel then accepted my view and kind of turned around and let that case go on. Interestingly, that case ended up going to the Supreme Court on an attorney's fee matter after the person prevailed in the district court below and set precedent in the Supreme Court. So, I mean, that's one way in terms of just helping the judge or judges with legal doctrine. But in that same term, I had a friend of mine who was clerking. The judge was about to affirm a dismissal of a employment discrimination case up in Washington. An African-American man had been working, I think, for the shipyard for many years, but at least in the view of some of the judges, was not able to sustain all the elements that he needed to prove to survive summary judgment. And my colleague then turned to the judge and said, "But Judge, if a person like this can't make it, who can?" And he thought about that, and that changed his mind. He reversed. And that wasn't a legal scholarly thing. That was just an appeal to the human side of things. And that's what I'm talking about. There's two sides of the clerkship. There's the scholastic side and there's the human side.
I'll add that in the 10 years that I've been counseling students, I have never in the 10 years had anyone who's done a clerkship and not loved it. I think the camaraderie is definitely inevitable that you get in close quarters, and the experience is also just incredible. And a lot of my students go and they do an externship, and that's for the first time they realize, oh, maybe I do want to clerk. So for those of you who are still law students, if you haven't had an externship experience, I definitely encourage you to try it out during the term or in the summer to get that exposure and that experience, because I think it's just an incredible way to get a feel for what it would be like. And even a court that you might not think you want to clerk for, maybe something different, or that might, you might want to think about the type of experience you want, whether it's an appellate experience or a trial court experience, it's more busy, or even an administrative law experience. There's so many different ways that you can get that experience in law school to just get an idea of, hey, maybe this is the type of clerkship I want to apply for. So I definitely encourage those of you who are still in law school to think about that.
Thank you so much for those wonderful answers. I think that was a great introduction to our discussion today. The next question that I have, I wanted to ask to Feiruz, actually, regarding how a law student would go about getting a clerkship. So what are the steps that you should take if you're a law student and you decide you want to clerk for a judge? And what are some tips that you would give for navigating this process?
Well, the first thing you want to do is talk to someone in your career office, in your CDO. And all of them have very specific information and different types of advice. Many law schools actually have a dedicated judicial clerkship counselor that you can actually talk to. And it's a really good overview and a good way to sit down with them. You definitely want to go ahead and have your resume or cover letter reviewed by them. Once you've got an idea of the type of clerkships you want to apply for, they'll also probably give you a sense of what your credentials look like in terms of getting different types of clerkships. So that's always a good preliminary conversation to have. Then you definitely want to go talk to your faculty, because one of the most important pieces of your application is going to be letters of recommendation. You're going to want 2 from faculty, 1 from a former employer as a general rule. Different judges might ask for a different combination, but generally that's what you want. And the one thing that I would definitely say when you do sit down and meet with your faculty, you want to provide them with a resume, and you want to have sort of an in-person meeting with them when you ask them. Also, you always want to give them an out as well, because you want someone who's going to write a strong letter for you. And you want to say to them, when you ask, I'd love for you to write me a letter of recommendation, but if you feel that you can't, or I'm not, you're not the best person to write for me, please let me know. And just be okay with whatever answer that they give you, because being a judicial clerkship counselor, I can go into the online platform, which is known as Oscar, and look at the letters. And there are some letters that I have to call the student up sometimes and say, have you thought about maybe asking somebody else, because they're not that strong. And you definitely want a strong letter. So I think that's a very strong component of your application. The next thing that you want to have together is a writing sample, and the writing sample is usually 5 to 10 pages. And the more current, the more recent one that you have, the better. You want to have legal analysis as much as possible in that letter. Writing sample. Sometimes students will ask me, well, I have a journal, a piece of my a journal note that I want to submit. What do you think about that? And I would say, stick with the legal analysis. You can always, give 5 pages of a memo, 5 pages of your journal article, and send both of them in if you feel really strongly about it, but you want to have something that has legal analysis. You also want to check in with your employer over the summer. Can I use something I've written for a writing sample? Because, sometimes they will not allow it. Sometimes I tell students, if they don't feel very strongly about things they did in their 1L year and they really want to use something from the summer with their employer, I will ask them, go ahead and have a conversation with the with your employer and ask them if they can give you a closed universe problem to work on that you could use as a writing sample. So even though you're not using something that you've actually submitted in a work format, you might be able to use it as a writing sample if you've crafted it and they can give you feedback on it. So those are things that you want to think about. Also, I think Cara mentioned before, there's so many different types of clerkships that you can do. You know, sometimes students come in and they say, you know, Ninth Circuit or bust, and we have to take a step back and go, okay, well, let's see if you understand what's happening in the Ninth Circuit. Have you thought about district courts? Have you thought about administrative law courts? There's so many specialty courts out there. There's like a tax court, a federal claims court, international trade court. So a lot of courts out there could be more tailored to your interests or be more broader. And I also think the out-of-state clerkships are really great too at the state court level, Supreme Courts, appellate courts. I would say avoid a superior court trial court out of state if you don't plan to practice in that state. But I think if you're going to go for the higher courts, wanting to come back to California, that's definitely something that you should consider. Two resources you might want to ask your law school about or have a conversation about is one is Oscar, which is the online system for clerkship application and review. You cannot access the system until the spring semester of your 2L year, but you can actually apply to federal clerkships through the system. The other one is the Vermont Law School Clerkship Guide. And I don't know, maybe not every law school has access to this, but I think a lot of the ones do. And basically it gives you state court clerkship information in all 50 states. So it's just basically, you know, gives you links, who to apply for, timelines. I would always check the information in the guide with what's actually happening on the court website for the state courts. That's just something you want to keep in mind. And one of the things I think is incredibly important is to find your allies in the law school, whether it's a counselor, whether it's a career advisor, whether it's a faculty advisor, someone who can really sit down with you and be a source of support and encouragement in your application process. Because putting it together can be a little daunting at first, but once you have it together, you have like an application that's ready to go, and you can just tweak it based on which court you're applying to and where you're applying. The other thing I would say, if you are applying out of state, you definitely want to make some connection to the court if possible. Maybe you've traveled there, maybe you have family in that state, maybe it's somewhere you've always wanted to live, or you're considering, you know, moving there for a short period of time. That's always a nice thing to sort of anchor you. It's not a necessity, but it's just something to think about. And the other thing I think that's incredibly important is you definitely want to connect with your alumni. You know, you definitely want to, you know, almost every law school tracks former law clerks that have gone through the process, and you want to connect with them. You want to apply to the judges they applied to, because they hired, you know, students from or graduates from your law school. So chances are, you know, your chances are pretty high there. Also, the law clerks have a lot of insight into what's happening in the court with a particular judge. They usually have a long-standing relationship with that judge even when their clerkship is over. So they can either put in a good word for you or advise you. They'll probably know about other judges also in the same court. So that's incredibly important. The other thing you want to think about is being geographically flexible. A lot of times my students are like, well, I just want to stay in San Francisco. I don't want to apply anywhere else. Well, you and everyone else in the country wants to apply to judges in San Francisco. So think about other areas, other urban areas, other more remote locales. You know, just thinking about being a little bit broad when you're applying. Also, don't limit yourself to the type of clerkship. So once again, you know, if you're just like Ninth Circuit or bust, definitely think about other clerkships, because clerkships also beget a clerkship. If you have a clerkship, you completed a clerkship, maybe at a lower court, maybe a higher court might look at you and say, okay, well, here's a candidate who's actually clerked before, knows what to expect, maybe is someone that I would consider. Because I think about 40% of federal law clerks, I think around that 40 or 50% are people who've actually had work experience for other clerkships. So that's something to keep in mind. So don't give up. Also, don't give up if you don't get a clerkship in law school, because once again, many people get hired a couple years out of law school. So that's something to think about as well. And for those of you who think you cannot afford to clerk, you can. You're not going to be paid the big bucks like you would be at a law firm, but In California, I think it's in the 70s that you would get paid at a state court level. And the federal courts are less than that, but also manageable. And you also qualify for law school loan forgiveness. So that's something to think about as well. So if you're on that track to maybe do a public service career down the road and you want some of the time to count towards that, your clerkship will count towards that. Is there anything else, Christina, you want me to address on that I may have missed?
No, I think that was a fantastic overview of some of the things that law students and graduates can look for if they want to clerk for a judge. I think that was great. Thank you so much. Would anybody else like to add something?
Yeah, can I offer two pieces of advice that I received when I was first thinking about clerking? The first is a piece of advice that I didn't hear until after I'd already gotten my first clerkship, but is one that I always want to pass along to students. This came from one of my mentors of color, and what she shared is that in that process of figuring out who your recommenders will be, you want to be really strategic in thinking through that. So what I mean by that is you want someone who can reflect on the type of writing and research ability that you'll bring to a chambers. So that makes someone that you were a research assistant for, or someone that you wrote a 35-page paper for your writing requirement, an excellent option. And to figure that out, you sort of have to start planning early. And so that's why I want to flag this for students now. Even in your 1L and 2L year, you can start thinking about, well, who's the professor that I'm likely to write my writing requirement with? What kind of relationship do I need to cultivate with them so that they can write me a great recommendation letter? That might require going to office hours. It might require trying to find more one-on-one time to get to know them. A second piece of advice is to just always be ready. There are so many things in the application process that are outside of your control. But a few things are completely in your control, and that includes having your resume, your writing sample, your cover letters, all of your ducks in a row. What I always tell students to do is keep a PDF and a Word version of all of your application materials saved in your email drafts folder, because you never know when you might meet someone at a networking event or at a bar event who says to you, oh, I happen to know Judge so-and-so, or I happen to know their clerk. I'd be happy to put in a good word for you, but send me your resume or send me your application materials. And if you sit on that for 3, 4, 5 days because you need some time to get all of your materials together, the window of opportunity may close. So within your control is preparedness. And so I would really strongly recommend having all of your materials as soon as they're ready, just having them on hand, just in case that opportunity comes knocking. So much of this is about being in the right place at the right time. And so you want to make sure that you're advocating for yourself by being fully prepared, preferably ahead of time. It is sort of like a rolling admissions process. So people that apply early do have an advantage, and you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to be well prepared.
And I've had a number of students that have met a judge or a former law clerk of a judge or a friend of a judge and gotten a clerkship that way. So what Cara's saying is absolutely spot on.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Christina, I've got just a couple of short comments as well. The cover letter, I think, is quite important. First of all, if it's got mistakes, if it doesn't look good, if it's got errors, at strike one, maybe even strike two. But, like everyone else, judges have egos. And there's nothing like receiving a letter from somebody who just doesn't say, I'd like to apply to your clerkship because, I want to get the experience. I'm very qualified. I've done this, this, and this. The ones that say, I followed your career, you've done this, or I was particularly interested in your decisions in this area. So the person knows the judge knows that this person has done some research. Now, it may be that that person does the same thing for all the other 20 judges. And so, we're not necessarily special, but still, it catches the attention to personalize it. It makes you feel that that person really wants to clerk for you, because we don't want to hire somebody who really doesn't want to clerk for us. The other thing is the letter of recommendation. I agree with what everybody said. The one thing I would add is sometimes there's something that somebody can say that you might not say about your record, your experience, that really might resonate. So for instance, if somebody didn't do extraordinarily well in their first year, their grades looked kind of mediocre, but second year started to improve, and we see a lot of this, especially from diverse students. It's nice to have a professor to explain what happened. The person had either there was some issues going on, there was economic issues, or they just had difficulty adjusting to the law school methodology, but once they caught on, they really shone. Or, you know, some kind of background. Those letters can be very valuable, not just saying this is a great researcher, but to say, here's why this person is extraordinary. Don't just look at the grade, the GPA. There's a lot more behind it, and let me tell you what that is. That's really invaluable.
And you want to get to know the people who are writing your letter. And I know that's super awkward sometimes, but the letter carries a lot of weight, especially since many students can actually apply earlier in their law school career when they haven't sort of proven a proven track record yet. And so showing that comprehensive piece of you, and I think storytelling is incredibly important, especially for people of color. I think, you know, for all of us, we all have something really unique about us to share, our family legacies, our achievements, you know, and we're sometimes more shy to share that. I have one faculty member who tells students, you write the draft of the letter, and then he sits down and interviews them, and he like pulls things out, pulls nuggets out. He writes the best letters I've ever seen. And you know, you have to kind of put that on the faculty member or the employer that you're sitting down and writing this with. I think Judge Chen's comment on the cover letter is incredibly important because it's part of your writing sample. I mean, they're looking at that, and mistakes are just not acceptable. So the other thing is you want to print all of your materials out, look at it, read it backwards, put it down, pick it up. You know, you just want to make sure it's flawless. Go back to it a couple of times. And you should do this with all employers anyway. But particularly, I mean, I've had judges tell me, you know, like I got, you know, XY from a student you recommended, but there was a mistake in the cover letter and I tossed it out. I just want you to know that. And so I don't want to hear that, you know? So to have other people look at it, look at your materials before you send it in.
Yeah. Thank you all. I think that was very enlightening and very important. And I think that all of these points remain true, even if our networking is going to be online or distance networking. I think all of those tips still hold true right now. Just a reminder to our audience, please send in questions if you have any specific questions to panelists. Make sure you use the Q&A box at the bottom. Don't use the chat, as some of those questions might get lost through other things that are being posted there. The Q&A box. Thank you so much. So the next question that I have, I would like to direct to Cara first. If you could you speak to some of the structural barriers that BIPOC law students may face during the clerkship application process? And maybe if you could discuss a little bit how to navigate and overcome some of those barriers.
Sure. So I'd say that one of the biggest barriers in approaching the application process is how it feels when you don't have any BIPOC clerk role models. When I applied for my first clerkship, I didn't know any Black clerks at my law school or in the jurisdiction where I was applying. Most of my classmates who were really vocal about how they were planning to apply for and achieve a clerkship were white, and they were focused on commercial and business law, not public service or public interest work. And so I always try to share with students that I made an incorrect assumption that I wasn't an ideal clerkship candidate, because I didn't see people like myself as role models and as folks that I knew I could reach out to get advice about the process. And as a result of that, I went through the application process without asking for help or support. Because frankly, I was scared that if I made it public that I wanted to be a judicial clerk and I really wanted this great but very difficult opportunity, that someone would tell me I wasn't qualified or would tell me that I was likely to fail. Obviously, that was not true. I am currently serving with my third judge. I have been a successful law clerk in all of the clerkships that I've had, but as a 2L, I didn't understand that. So I want to encourage you to be brave in this process and to be open to the possibility of having to make yourself a little bit vulnerable. You should not be afraid to ask for help or for guidance. There are so many people who want to help support diverse clerkship candidates. For example, this entire panel. At Berkeley, I've convened a group of over 100 diverse alumni clerks who volunteer to serve as a resource to diverse students applying for clerkships. So ask your career placement offices for their list of alumni clerks of color or alumni clerks who have specified their willingness to serve as mentors to historically underrepresented students, even if they themselves are not from a historically underrepresented group. And if your career placement office doesn't have that resource available yet, ask them to please help create it. The networking that is required to get a clerkship is hugely important. And so you want to make sure that if you are looking at this process and you're saying, but I don't know anyone who's ever clerked before, I don't know anyone that can help me, that's exactly the right time that you should be reaching out to career services, looking at your alumni resources. I promise you that if you reach out to a diverse alumni clerk and say, I'm really interested in clerking, but I don't know where to start, would you be willing to help me? Their answer is most likely going to be yes, because all of us went through something similar where we either didn't know what to do first or we needed to ask for help. So please don't be afraid of seeking out guidance. I think sometimes when we make assumptions about our own capabilities, we block ourselves in, when I am confident that everyone that's participating in this panel today could be an excellent, excellent law clerk. And a big part of that is just believing that you are the kind of person who can contribute meaningfully to a judicial clerkship.
Just to follow up on Cara's point, I just put a couple resources in the chat that you may or may not be aware of. One is the Judicial Internship Opportunity Program. It's basically a summer program where you can extern for a judge that's interested in hiring a BIPOC student. And it's at minimum 6 weeks. Sometimes people do split summers. It's usually 6 to 8. And they have different locations all over the metropolitan United States, and some in Texas and Illinois, in different parts of Illinois and California as well. And they actually are one of the few that provide a $2,000 stipend, which most externships are unpaid. The other one was Share the Wealth. And Share the Wealth is an excellent program where you get considered for seven federal judicial district court clerkships, and bankruptcy court, and a magistrate clerkship in one interview. The deadline has passed. It was in July, but it's for rising 3Ls and law school graduates. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's usually, the deadline is over the summer, but it's a great opportunity to apply for a clerkship, and you have to be on Oscar to be able to apply for that. Law Clerks for Diversity was formed in a post-George Floyd environment. And it's a group of law clerks, one in Hawaii and one in Arizona, that came together and decided they wanted to increase diversity in judicial law clerkships and wanted to create a mentorship program. And I just talked to one of the founders on the phone yesterday. And she basically said it's a match where they are recruiting law clerks to mentor law students and recent graduates who are interested in clerking. They received 700 applications from mentors and mentees. So currently they're closed. There's a link in the chat that I put in, but they're going to open up soon once they match these groups. And they want to have it as a rolling basis. They want to have educational webinars, one-on-one mentorship opportunities. So it's definitely one you should keep in mind.
Worth noting that for me, for many other first generation or law students of color, the decision to clerk is a financial one, and in a short-term and a long-term decision too. You'll often hear at least a long-term consideration addressed about, you may, if you end up going to a law firm, getting a clerkship bonus is something that might make up for a year of a lower salary. But in the short term, I think that's a really significant barrier where you're trying to figure out how to pay for delivering postal copies to or applications to judges at FedEx, and putting that on a credit card at the same time that you're trying to pay for a bar prep course. Those are decisions that are frankly the kinds that you can't avoid and do have consequences. For me, in terms of overcoming some of those questions, it was groups like California ChangeLawyers and funding that they offer to students interested in public interest at the end of their third year, basically covering the cost of bar prep, and for me, even the cost of moving from California to Ohio for a clerkship, things that, an expense that otherwise could be prohibitive. So there are groups out there, and just as Cara said, there are people, frankly, looking to help you at each and every turn. And so I think the starting point for each of these is to ask for help. And that's exactly how you find these opportunities to both solve some of the trickier financial questions, and then just really being in the position or prepared to deliver the very best materials with your application.
Thank you so much. So I think the next question that we have is for Judge Chen, to speak to a little bit what you look for in law clerks, and then more specifically as a judge, if you could speak to what the significance is of having someone clerk for you who might be coming from an underrepresented community in law, or someone who's overcome some of the barriers that we've been discussing.
Sure. Especially given the work we do, there's a real premium in helping the judge go through legal motions, and therefore, the bulk of the work is legal research and writing, summarizing, condensing, doing independent analysis, and providing the judge with some guidance in terms of decision making. And so therefore, whatever we look for, somebody's got to be able to do that work. Somebody has to be able to do research things accurately and well, and then be able to put that to writing, because the usual process, I think in most courts, is to have, for instance, after the briefs are filed, to have somebody look at that, analyze the briefs, read the cases, read the statutes, and then do what's called a bench memo for the judge that prepares, that summarizes the issues, gives an analysis, an independent analysis, and that's the basis for a future potential ruling. It's a basis is how we prepare for oral argument and how we know what questions to ask. And that's all done in a fairly short time frame. So I have to be confident that somebody is able to do that basic work, because without that, it just doesn't work. But more than that, it's important for me to have somebody who cares, who has as much dedication and enthusiasm for our system of justice and dedication to equal access to justice as I do. Because if they're just here, doing a job, or is this just a stepping stone, and their heart's not in it, it can show. So, somebody who enjoys, shares the enthusiasm I share about doing this job and understanding the importance of this job is really important. Like all positions, when you have diverse folks, when you have people at the table, part of the decision-making process from different backgrounds, it really does enrich the discussion. Just your take on a witness or your take on a case. Like I said earlier, what's fair? The man who's going to have summary judgment granted against him, somebody had to say something to put that in a larger societal life perspective. And sometimes that's what people from different backgrounds can bring. And so there's a lot to learn. I analogize this to the cross-section requirement of a jury. There's a reason why the Sixth Amendment requires a cross-section of the community. The idea is that we get diversity. That's the institutionalization by the Constitution of the idea of diversity in decision-making in particular. And I think that's the model. It's the model I think we ought to follow. I think I've written on the need for diversity amongst the judiciary itself. And I think that applies equally to those who assist the judges, i.e. law clerks.
Thank you. I think that was very helpful. Does anybody have anything to add, or if we can move on to the next one? So the next question I have is for Stephen, and this is a little bit more practical in our last 15 minutes here. I think we should get into, well, first off, what a week in the life of a law clerk might look like, but specifically how law clerks are going to be able to contextualize some of these everyday tasks within a greater goal of promoting a more equitable justice system, and what that might look like day to day.
Well, as has been explained before, the variety across clerkships is really meaningful. And so the day in the life or a week different. I guess I can speak to the appellate experience, which is to say that you have maybe 2 or 3 cases every 6 or so weeks. And so it looks a lot like law school in that way, that you are doing research and writing, and that is your primary duty. The other work so in those cases, those 3 or 4 to 5 to maybe around a half dozen, those are cases that are going to be argued and are going to get the full attention of 3 judges and their clerks. And we'll have a bench memo, all of that work before you ever really reach a decision, and certainly before an opinion is published in a given case. But there are several other types of cases that you will see, and frankly, as a law clerk, you'll have even wider discretion. And often those are habeas petitions, cases filed by pro se litigants. And I think on the question of how do you contextualize your work as a clerk, in those moments, it's important to recognize that for many pro se litigants, for so many of the people who come before a court, there is no background of privilege or class, and that frankly coming into a courtroom is a sort of othering experience for many of them, and that one of the best things you can do as a clerk then, and I think when you first open up the briefs and are first looking into the record of a case, is to have in mind that you want to present to your judge the reality that there's a human, a litigant on the other side of that case, because there are several. As a clerk, you may have just 2 to 3 cases, but your judge and the court on the whole is obviously seeing a much more varied docket. And so at each opportunity to remind you, your co-clerks, the judges on your panel or the judge you work for, of the reality of a given case is an opportunity I hope you'll take at each point in your clerkship. The other specific moment I'll think of in terms of how you can really contextualize this and move the ball is that we've already talked about clerkship hiring, but that you'll find that's among the areas in which clerks play a really meaningful role when it comes to sorting through the many applications that show up. And so it's obviously ideal if you could have a recommender say, this is the trajectory that I was on in the course of law school. But for me, and as a clerk from a background that isn't the typical law clerk, it also means looking for opportunities to find that same takeaway from an applicant's materials. And for me, that means, I'm a Berkeley Law graduate, but my family members, my siblings went to HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, that are institutions that just don't have the same name recognition as many others, but are obviously going to be experiences that would inform perhaps the perspective that a potential clerk might bring to your chambers. If it's someone you think is a good fit for your chambers, that's a chance to advocate for them. And it starts among your co-clerks first and foremost, in terms of sorting through truly many applications, but it's a chance to call out the things that not every other person from maybe your law school or your undergrad or the place you grew up might call out and recognize as a credential that makes them a good fit.
I'd also add that it really depends on the type of court that you're in, what your weekly schedule might look like. District court, trial court tends to be very fast-paced with lots and lots of different issues every single week. You might have hearings once or twice a week, case management conferences to attend as well. A federal appellate court tends to be a much more cloistered sort of quiet endeavor. And so you might want to think a little bit about your personality and the type of work that you're really interested in doing professionally as you think about what type of court might be best suited for your strengths. I'll say that the clerkship that I'm working in now at the California Supreme Court is incredibly different from my last appellate clerkship. In my federal appellate clerkship, the attorneys for the judges were not allowed to speak to each other about the cases, and that's pretty typical. Usually, it's the judges talking to other judges, usually in writing. the clerks sort of stay out of it. But in my current position at the California Supreme Court, the attorneys have a great deal of interaction. We're constantly going into each other's offices, bouncing ideas around, asking them about details on cases, getting their thoughts on documents that we have circulated and where they sort of think they are on the case, what their judge might be thinking about the case. And so it's an interesting position because it's really sort of a hybrid between the fast pace of district court and the interaction of district court, and then the more sort of research and writing based appellate clerkship. And so again, this requires asking for help and asking for advice from people that have been in those positions before, but you should also delve in and ask that question. What does a week look like for you in your chambers? What does a regular schedule look like for you? And, ask follow-up questions, get a sense of whether you think that placement might be the best fit for you personally, because the fit really does matter, both in terms of how you mesh with your judge and your co-clerks. And so your happiness does really matter. And those are things that you can do in your background research before you submit any applications.
Christina, can I say a word about, you talk about contextualization. There's another benefit to clerkship, in addition to hopefully becoming to learn how to write more succinctly, more clearly, how to research more quickly, gaining the networking, gaining the mentorship of the judge, and hoping to forge lifelong relationships. And that is, especially if you're in a fast-paced court like ours, you see enough cases, you see enough motions that you get a real understanding of how the law really works in real life. What the impact of the things you studied in school? For instance, the Twombly and Iqbal pleading standards. What does that really mean? And how does that affect access to justice? If you handle a dozen motions to dismiss in cases where people couldn't get heard, you might have some understanding of how these laws play out. AT&T versus Concepcion, we have many, many motions to compel arbitrations, taking cases out of court and into the realm of private mediation. But when you see those facts, when you see these patterns come up, you gain an understanding, even if you're only there for a year, about how the system really works, and hopefully give you some ideas about whether it works or not. If you think it doesn't work fairly, you think that access to justice is being compromised, then you've got a basis to advocate. You've got a basis to think about how you want to conduct your career afterwards. You can have a focus, because just 1 year experiment in seeing cases and how they affect human lives gives you an understanding you could not get from the outside. And so those who are interested in doing work in the public interest, looking for justice, equal access, there's no better laboratory, frankly, than the courts.
Certainly, yeah. Thank you so much for all of your insightful answers to some fairly difficult questions. So we have some time now for audience questions and answers. You can still add your questions if you have any that have arisen by posting them once again into the Q&A box below. Our first question, and I think these are going to be, well, this one's general, so it can go to anybody who would like to answer. First, how do you make your clerkship application stand out if your law school grades are just average?
Well, I'll just say a quick word, then I'm sure Bruce will have a lot to say about that. There are things you can do in terms of what you've done, that makes you different, extraordinary, whether work or life experiences. Again, the letter of recommendation can say, although the grades, especially the beginning grades of the student, may not be, at the top of the class, there's something extraordinary about that student. So you have to find sort of a narrative or other qualities that can be either showcased in your resume, in your cover letter, by a letter of recommendation, something that shows that you are presenting something that's different from everybody else, and that grades is everything. And which is true, grades are not everything. I've had students with top grades that don't do nearly as well as one would have expected. So, yeah, but I'm sure maybe Farouz, you had something to say.
No, I don't. I'm going to piggyback on what you just said. I think you have to think about your application as a whole, right? So once again, where, I mean, maybe you're on journal, maybe you're not on the premier journal, but you have a note that you're working on. Maybe you have an out of the ballpark letter of recommendation where your employer is talking about what an incredibly well-rounded person you are, how they can rely on you, your skills, your faculty is writing something similar. Like, so you have to think about your application as a whole. Maybe that cover letter is really targeted to that judge or really targeted to that experience. Also having, judicial experience really helps. So once again, the externships. I mean, I had one student who really wanted to clerk, and he was in the bottom 50% of the class, and he actually externed for a California Court of Appeal judge who, in the Court of Appeal in California, does not hire law clerks. But the judge loved him and wrote this amazing letter that said, if I could hire him, I would, but I can't because I can't hire law clerks. And, he added that letter, along with his other application materials, and it took a while. I mean, he applied to many clerkships, but he got one. And then after that, he got another clerkship, and now he's a staff attorney because that's all he ever wanted to do. So part of it is tenacity too, right? Like thinking, like going back and putting your best foot forward, working with your counselors, working with your faculty, really thinking about yourself in a different way. Because sometimes what happens in law school is we get very dejected after we get our grades. And we start to like buy into the fact that we are all about these grades when that isn't the case. You are like a smart, intelligent, hardworking person who can contribute so much. Think of yourself that way when you're writing your application, and things will start to click for you.
I think for applicants who are worried about what their law school grades might look like, applying again or applying for the first time after a year or two of practice, especially if you have an interest in a really particular area, like let's say you're really interested in patent law, for example. Having a couple years of experience in a highly specialized area will certainly make you a great candidate when you do apply for a clerkship. I'll even say that in between my second clerkship and my current position, I worked in local government law, and it has been incredibly helpful for me now that I'm at the California Supreme Court thinking about issues of public law all the time. Having some work experience to ground your work as a clerk is obviously going to be very helpful. And that can also be a way to just pad your resume, give you some really interesting perspectives to bring to chambers. So if you feel like you do not have the strongest application package ready in your 2L year, that's okay. Do not be discouraged, but just don't forget about the goal of clerking after a year or two. You can always come back to it.
Thank you. So the next question I have is really, I'm going to combine a couple questions that we've received, and this question really speaks to how can a law clerk speak to who they are as a person. And some of the questions that we got, I'll just read them so that you all have some context here. But would being involved in advocacy such as immigration reform lead a judge to think that they're too politically involved and not consider, and therefore not consider them for the position? And then secondly, during the application process, how should one strike a balance between weaving and pulling out their personal story without tokenizing themselves, but also highlighting their true academic credentials?
I answered that in the chat because I was confused about when we were supposed to answer these. So some people probably already saw my answers to that. I would say for the first question, you don't want to work for a judge that's going to look at your experience that way. Look at who appointed them to office. Check out Leadership Library, which many law schools have, where you can actually go in and see some information about who their law clerks are. Talk to your law school about maybe specific judge alumni. Once again, where have clerks from your law school clerked? Target those judges, contact them, maybe ask them about other judges that have worked within those courts that might be of interest to you to apply to. All of those things are going to be part of your research and who you want to apply to, but you don't want to apply to someone who has that view of you. Christina, I'm sorry, I forgot the second question. that you asked?
Yeah, that's fine. I think the second part was how to strike a balance between somebody's personal story without tokenizing themselves, and how to highlight really their academic achievements and weave that into their personal story without that being tokenized.
I think it's really, the personal story is so nuanced and balanced, right? And what you want to share versus what you want to hold back on or give a flavor of sharing is going to be something that you should have someone take a look at your materials and give you advice on. It's so personalized. I think giving general information about that is hard to do. I would love for the other panelists to chime in on this, but I think like sitting down with your CDO counselor, someone who's looked at multiple letters and like writing out your story and then showing it to them and going back and forth. I've done that with so many students, like on an individual level, like, okay, and then I'll ask certain questions and maybe pull out something else from your story that you didn't even think of. Like I always share this story of one of my students when he was in high school. He was in band, and then over time they were doing budget cuts. They were getting rid of his music program. So he called up all his friends that he was still really close to and said, hey, we should donate our instruments. We should find a way to get a music teacher to volunteer. This is terrible. This is like so defining for me. And eventually that turned into a nonprofit. He had a little bit of a leadership role, and then he left because he went to law school, went on and did a different career, and totally did not talk about it. It was like a blip in the resume. And I said, you know what? You need to talk about that in your cover letter. And in all his clerkship interviews, it's all the judges wanted to talk to him about. So like you never know what it is about your specific story that's going to be picked up from someone. But I think if you're not sure about it, or you like have either a trusted faculty member or a career counselor take a look.
Can I say something about the on the first question? I agree. If you, first of all, you got to do what you think is right. You got to follow your heart. I would not like not take a job because I think that's some judge is going to look with the cast some dispersion on it. You got to do what's right. And I agree that if a judge is hostile to that particular interest, well, maybe that's not the judge you want to work for. On the other hand, I think it's worth having. I like to see a resume, for instance, somebody who's taking classes in a breadth of courses. I'm a little bit leery when somebody has only taken, clinics and public, interest jobs or courses in one area, might be immigration, might be something else, or just criminal, and hasn't taken any of the other stuff, because at least our job is very broad. I mean, the breadth of this job is extremely expansive. And I want somebody who's just as happy to work on a patent case as they are a constitutional case. And so, so there is a bit of trade-off. You got to do what, you want to take the classes that you're interested in. You want to do the clinics that you're devoted to. But I think, keep in mind, I just think it's a good idea for educational breadth. Take a class in bankruptcy, business associations, other things that you might not think you're interested in, but I think makes you a broader person. And I think that might allay some of the concerns that some judges who are not necessarily hostile, but they're looking for breadth. And if they only see one kind of case, one kind of coursework that you've done, that you can mitigate that by broadening out, your educational experience a bit.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add on this question? Okay. The next question I have is, how do law clerks handle, so this would be once somebody's in a clerkship position, but how could a law clerk handle issues that they might experience in chambers? Who would they speak to if they feel uncomfortable for reasons involving racialized bias, gender discrimination, harassment, or anything like that?
Well, I mean, maybe Cara can say something. I'll just say that has been a huge problem, and it came to surface a couple of years ago with where the Ninth Circuit judges in terms of his conduct, and there's other instances, there has been some real institutionalized reform that has now been enacted, both coming from the national conference, judicial conference, as well as from our circuit. So we do have a structure now, and I don't know, Cara, if you're familiar with it or somebody else is, but we do have an EDR unit. We do have, the idea was to create a path so you don't just have to go to your judge, you don't just have to go internal, you can go external, almost like an ombudsman, somebody on the outside that you can go to for advice, for counseling, or to file a complaint. And that's kind of the model that the Ninth Circuit and all the district courts underneath the Ninth Circuit have adopted. I think these issues now have become much more serious, and thankfully it's finally come to light in a way. And I can tell you there have been a lot of judicial conferences, meetings to talk about this very issues. Committees have been appointed. So now I don't know whether there have been any empirical studies about how well it's working. But there definitely has been a movement over the last 2 years to do something structurally different than what was there before. Cara, I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll add that I think, as Judge Chen explained, there are the more formalized pathways, whether it's, sometimes talking to your judge can be a great avenue, or your HR department, or like on the Ninth Circuit, they have this specialized office. But what we found at the California Supreme Court is that it's also important to create more informal avenues for discussion before something becomes an issue that actually arises to like the level of harassment. So something that we've done in the last couple of years is create a formal equity and inclusion committee. And that's a space where people from all across the court community are able to gather together to help plan and facilitate discussion opportunities and spaces for us as a court community to come together. We also have established affinity groups. So we have an attorneys of color, a gathering every month. There's an LGBTQIA+ gathering that happens usually every other month. And there's a gender equity group. And what we found is that having some opportunities to have more of these informal conversations, to develop mentorship type relationships where you can have a conversation with someone, sort of that, let me do a gut check with you about this thing that happened, maybe sharing strategies about how to approach someone that you're struggling to connect with, will hopefully help to address some of these issues before they arise to the level of like national news and a real debacle. But I do think it's something that is challenging. I think it's challenging in every legal workplace, and something that you might want to look for as a student of color or as a historically underrepresented person is, what is the individual court that you're applying to doing and thinking about these sorts of resources? Are there affinity groups that you can be a member of once you join in that court community? Those are questions that, again, you can ask people who are currently working there, or if it's appropriate in an interview, perhaps in the time that you're speaking only with clerks, you might try to probe some of those questions as well.
The only thing I'd add on this point is just that the same people who helped you apply to clerkships in the first instance, whether it's an alumni association or affiliation, or someone who perhaps clerked for that judge previously, those are still your resources to help you and who have at least a year's experience with that judge. And that's another network that exists and is going to be perhaps the best one for understanding how to navigate some of the really tricky personal issues, because I'll be frank, in the court I clerked at, there wasn't really a structure for, it was almost entirely informal, I should say, in terms of handling these sort of issues. And that's complicated when you're a clerk, and these roles you're in max 1 to 2 years. And so a relatively junior member of whatever organization.
Thank you. I think that was really helpful. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So let me, sorry, just deciding on which one we're looking at here. So one of the questions here is about the restrictions that are imposed on law clerks' political activities. Can you guys speak to what those restrictions are and how a law clerk might be able to navigate those restrictions?
Silence. Well, judges, of course, are bound by certain ethical rules, and law clerks, in large part, are bound by very similar ethical constraints, it seems to me, because you are a representative of the judge. The question also often comes up, can I attend a demonstration, a protest, a rally? Can I be seen? And I'm not sure there's a crystal clear answer to that. I think a lot of judges and some ethical people say, well, if it's politically controversial and you're working for the court, if you use as a standard, would you want your face on the front page of a newspaper and your identification of who you work for, to have a member of the judiciary, which is supposed to be above the fray, impartial and neutral, not engaged in sort of issues that may sort of present themselves in court, then you could take the very cautious approach of saying no. Other people feel like, you have a First Amendment right, and you're not necessarily using your office to protest. I think most judges would feel that if something is controversial, caution is better, because your voice is going to be heard through this institution and through the decisions that we make, and that's the real impact of the work that you do. And it's an easier thing to say to somebody who's just a term clerk, that is, they're going to be there only for a year or 2 years, because you can say, once you get out, then you can use all the skills and all the things you've learned and do what, to engage fully, but you shouldn't do that now. Somebody who's a career clerk, it's a little harder to tell them, but in a way, judges are sort of in the same boat. We can't be engaged in any kind of electoral politics and partisan politics, can't really speak on issues, although, many of us would like to say something. There's been a bit of a change. You saw a couple of Supreme Courts, Washington State Supreme Court, California Supreme Court, Massachusetts, come out with very powerful statements about in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. And that was pretty extraordinary, frankly. And so, I don't know where the answer lies, but I will say that, there is a kind of awakening that I hope is sustained, where that changes the line as to what people can do, in their free time, a little less clear. I don't know if in the state courts you have other experiences in that field. I don't know, Cara, do you?
Well, so we aren't bound by the Hatch Act as state court employees. So we have a little bit more flexibility, but the general approach for us is that we are supposed to, as you said, engage as though we are extensions of our judge. And so many people understand that to mean that we are bound by the same restrictions. Again, I think, the central tenet here is maintaining the public trust, making sure that anything that you do in your personal capacity doesn't bring any sort of question to the personal trust in the public trust in the court. And so it can be painful at times to be a clerk and to not be able to say certain things or post on Facebook or publicly donate in certain ways. And so I do think it's something that's worth considering. But again, like Judge Chen said, especially if you're thinking about a term clerkship of just 1 or 2 years, you can do anything for about 1 year. So hopefully it's not something that will deter you from the incredible public service opportunity that a clerkship can bring.
Thank you both. I think, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. On that note, thank you so much to all of our distinguished panelists for telling us why law clerking is so important, what clerkship means for students and graduates of color. We hope we've shed some light onto this career path. And to our audience members, the organizers of this webinar will be following up with you all via email with additional resources. Be on the lookout for that in the next few days. We'll include a link to today's recording, information on how to join our LinkedIn group, as well as some other helpful resources. And you can use that to reach out to us too if you have any additional questions about today's topic or anything else. So with that, thank you so much, everybody, for attending. We hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day.